Perfect. Okay, I think it's a good time to start right now. The presentation is still going on. You can read it if you want. Welcome everyone to the EBA Symposium on Programmatic Assessment. My name is Liberta de Jong. I will be chairing today's session. And next to me, I don't know where next to me on your screen, is sitting Kees van der Vleuten. As a co-chair, he will be leading the panel expert discussions today. Today we will learn about 3 different implementations of programmatic assessment from all around the world. It's a great pleasure for me to announce today's presenters. First, Dr. Glendon Tate will present the implementation at the University of Toronto, Canada. Then Professor Amir Sam will present the implementation at the Imperial College in London, UK. And last but definitely not least, Professor Lambert Stewart will present the implementation at Flinders University, Australia. Furthermore, Dario Tor, Suzanne Schut, Professor Luc Dawson, and Dr. Harold Bock are experts within the field, and they will reflect on the presented implementation. So, welcome to all presenters and panel members. It's an honor to have you here all online. Before Kees will further introduce the focus of today's symposium, I would like to highlight some technical features, which are also on the slide you're seeing right now. During this session, you can chat with other attendees in the public chat box. It's on the right bottom of your screen. But you can also ask questions. And if you want to ask a question, please use the question mark just above the text box. And don't forget to mention your name and where you're from, because it's nice for us to hear where you're from. Depending on the time schedule and the number of questions, I will highlight some questions. But we have kind of a tight schedule, so hopefully I can publish some questions. If your question has not been answered, please don't worry. You can stay in contact afterwards with the presenters, panel members, and other attendees. To do so, you can give permission to the EBMA conference organization for sharing your name and email address with the attendees of the conference. You can do so by filling in the survey at the end of the session. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Welcome, everyone, and I would like to give the word to Kees.
Thank you, Liberta. Welcome, everyone, from all over the world to this symposium on programmatic assessment. I don't think that I need to explain what programmatic assessment is for this audience, but I think I want to highlight a publication on programmatic assessment in a Dutch book that came out this week. Because people say to me, nice ideas, programmatic assessment, but how does it work in actual practice? And in this little book, we have 9 different Dutch implementations, which we interviewed and on which we reflected on their implementations. The purpose of this symposium is exactly also this, but now from an international perspective. And fortunately, we have implementations from right across the world. And it's interesting to learn from them, to look at how they have implemented it, what kind of problems they encountered, how they have worked around some of the more difficult principles in programmatic assessment. So that's the purpose of our symposium today. We have 3 presenters from 3 different implementations, and we have a panel of experts who will then reflect on that implementation. In the meantime, you can ask questions, if you like, via the chat box. Glendon, can I give you the online floor next and to talk about the implementation of the University of Toronto? Glendon, can you turn on your mic and your camera? Yes, perfect.
Apologies.
Perfect. Go right ahead, Glendon.
All right, well, thank you. Great to be here. And just wanted to talk first a little bit about our context in the University of Toronto. Really large public institution. It's one of the oldest universities in Canada, and certainly one of the oldest medical schools, and also one of the largest. We have 270 students per year, and this goes across 2 campuses and 4 academies. The academies are basically little mini medical schools that are clustered around hospital groups. Just a little bit about our students. So this is a post-bachelor's program. The majority of people have a bachelor's degree, and about 20% have a graduate or another professional degree. And like most medical schools, very high entering GPA. Just a little bit about the why we engaged in this in the first place. This is a paper that we published in Medical Teacher in 2018, and really, like most medical schools that engage in curriculum renewal, we did this because of changing needs of society and changing desire of what sort of doctor we're hoping to produce, and according to best evidence. And as you can see in the title here regarding the alignment imperative, we took the opportunity to try and address some of the gaps between pedagogy and what ends up happening in practice by looking at some of these misalignments. We engaged really in the first major curriculum renewal since 1993. We previously had a very traditional medical program in a preclinical and clinical model. And the timing worked out that we were able to implement programmatic assessment at the same time. So in fact, we took a really integrated approach to this to synchronously renew curriculum assessment, faculty development, and program evaluation at the same time, which I think that timing is important to some of the outcomes that we've had. Certainly the goals of the curriculum were to have a more flexible program for learners, more focus on assessment for learning, more emphasis on the cognitive sciences, so cognitive integration, and really trying to help produce physicians who are team-based players who can function in complex systems, which we all work in. I just created this Wordle, which we have new overall program goals. Of course, under that is a competency framework, but the goals for our program about what kind of physicians we aspire to produce. And you can see that many of these words that come from our MD program goals rely heavily on metacognitive capacities. And certainly our curriculum renewal and assessment renewal helps to both rely on those metacognitive competencies and to develop them further. Briefly, the structure of the new curriculum is, and I'm referring to the Foundations curriculum, which is our pre-clerkship curriculum, which I will speak to in a moment, that we took on first in our renewal. This is clustered around 5 courses that run consecutively, and then there's 4 components which relate to the major buckets of delivery of that curriculum. And then there's themes that run longitudinally across all of the courses. Again, an important point that because we were embarking on literally a full kind of whiteboard of our curriculum, we were starting from scratch, and we had to apply 18 months in advance to our national accrediting body. The advantage of this was that when we were at this stage of designing the curriculum structure, we were able to ensure that the structure and policies would allow programmatic assessment to come to life. So as I pointed out, the initial mandate was for the first half, and there was pros and cons to doing this in a staggered approach, but the clerkship and second half implementation of programmatic assessment has been more in a gradual fashion, although more substantively underway now as we move to implementing EPAs in a more fulsome way and a workplace-based assessment kind of renewal, and that's a focus for most Canadian medical schools right now. As I pointed out, really important that we were able to align the curriculum and assessment aspects of the renewal, governance, and approach. And we took a rigorous project management approach to this. This initially involved external project management firm who helped us for the first couple of years of planning and implementation, although that approach became so important in a way that we worked that we ultimately have kind of permanent project managers within our curriculum and assessment offices, which has been invaluable. The key assessment components, I think, are those that are similar to most medical schools, which are listed here. A couple of points about our written assessments. Certainly the written assessments, which are a mainstay of any program, moving from kind of end of term or end of year high stakes assessments to much more frequent. We have weekly feedback quizzes. Those are really formative. We have mastery exercises, which are every 1 to 3 weeks to assess mastery of content as the program is going. I point out that this is an aggregate pass because the pass mark for these is basically determined for the entire course. So students can be unsuccessful on individual ones. That does not mean they don't have to address deficits, because in fact, even if they don't pass one of those small data points, they get triggered for what we call a check-in, and that check-in with one of the curriculum directors helps to identify what's going on and to intervene early and help support them. The students get told on the first day during the orientation that by the end of the first course, which is about 6 weeks, that about half of the class will have had check-ins, and pretty much everyone within the first year will have, which means they will have had some chunk on which they have not been successful. So that's become a culture they're quite acclimatized to. Couple of other points. I'm going to speak shortly about the portfolio course and the relevance of that to our coaching. And we embarked on a almost 2-year project based on the evidence and various practices to implement a new professionalism form, which runs across the whole program instead of a bunch of tools that were used previously. And we moved this to a more competency-based approach instead of the more punitive lapse-based approach to professionalism, which previously existed. As part of this new curriculum and assessment framework, which I should say, by the way, we launched in 2016, we also developed our own progress test. Several reasons why we ended up using our own, but this is an end of program competency-based examination. It's aligned in format with the Medical Council of Canada exam, which everyone in Canada needs to pass. It's 3 times a year. It's 100 questions. It's formative. And so far, our research on this has shown that it quite strongly correlates with many other aspects of our program. This has also been important for engaging students in something that is formative, because we're now able to show them of its predictive ability on many other parts of our program, and ultimately with the Medical Council of Canada practice exam, and we presume with the actual one, although our first set of data for those students is pending at the moment. Just to give a sense, relating to the curriculum cube that I showed, our course outcomes, again, these are consecutive courses. The structure was built so that we could make intermediate stakes decisions as the year was rolling, recognizing again that some of the major themes in the program are running longitudinally, but that means that each of these time posts, students are being assessed on their progress to that point, and that a decision does have to be made around that course. The nomenclature that we have for how the year is rolling is that someone is in satisfactory progress, which means they're meeting all of the standards for the various components. Partial progress, they have not met standard in one of the components. If that happens, the usual outcome is that they will get a focused learning plan, which is developed with the curriculum directors and the student, followed by a reassessment. And finally, unsatisfactory progress, which means there is a more global deficit in several areas. And the usual outcome for this, although the broader context is considered, is that the student would need remediation and repeat the course. That would require them to actually repeat the year, because the courses obviously are not offered more than once in a year. That is an extremely low number of people, and for the most part, those are people who are in difficulty due to a variety of circumstances, and some of them end up being in serial difficulty. This is just a couple of screenshots of our electronic portfolio, which has been really crucial to this approach. This is the MD program learner chart. I have to give credit to Case because, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago when I had a Skype call with him and we were brainstorming about the electronic portfolio, we were talking about the parallels of its function with a patient chart in tracking someone longitudinally over time. It resonated with our program, and that has been the name of it. So we took a decision to build our own after examining several best practice ones, including Mestrict, and that was because too many of the technological systems that lived behind our assessment functions that ultimately roll up into what is the user interface, the learner chart, were not workable with other systems. So we built our own. We took a user centric design approach and launched this. This provides both competency-based and time-based view of all of the assessment data for students. It is used for them to track progress. It's used for their coaches to review their performance, and twice a year when their coaches review with them their performance and the students document this in progress reviews. This gets also uploaded to the learner chart, and all of this data can be viewed by the Student Progress Committee and other program leadership who support students. Interestingly, after the first year of this, we took we did a usability study, a little bit different from a purely scholarly approach, in that we employed consultants who look at how people use products in general in other consumer products, because that's what they basically are in this context. This was very valuable because we learned some lessons about how the program was used and not used, and made some significant adaptations. Just to show here, for example, this is a time-based view. One of the things we learned was that many students did not want to see the class average directly, so we built a toggle. They can turn that on and off. And other thing was that they, interestingly, did not have resonate with them having the primary way to view their data through CanMed's competencies. They wanted to review it more as a dashboard. And this actually had us understand that perhaps during the curriculum, they were not having it resonate yet. We keep on track with several different ways. The coaching is very important, which I'll speak to in a moment. We had to build explicit processes for tracking and supporting students and for using data to help decide how we should identify people for support, even if they hadn't failed a standard. Our portfolio course that I referred to, this was previously a professional development course and personal identity development course. We use the R2C2 model for our coaching, and these tutors become the coaches for these students. This has been really interesting because the topics are quite intimate in this, around their first cadaveric experience, processing their first death, things like this. And so I think it became a context, and we are studying this right now, but the relationship underpinning this was very important and allowed a strong coaching context to emerge. It's a very labor-intensive role that is the first role that gets filled in our recruitment efforts for our teachers, which says something about the rewards that come with it. Our Student Progress Committee, just briefly, we previously had just a board of examiners. This is an intermediary body that we built with people with high-stakes decision-making expertise and qualitative expertise, including education scientists, and really to develop an approach that ensures the expert professional judgment allows us to make good decisions. And over time, we've seen that the innovation in this has been not so much just in what the decision is, but in the outcomes for those students, so that it's not just about data, but context in terms of helping to decide what their remediation should look like. Just briefly, some of the enablers for our approach here. The timing I pointed out was important because we did not decide to do programmatic assessment as a one-off separate thing from the curriculum. I think this was crucial because we were whiteboarding the curriculum. It gave us a lot more latitude. That does not mean that we don't still have the constraints of existing in a traditional university, which has regulations that are designed for non-professional programs. So for example, we can't have a purely holistic approach just to get a gestalt of data and decide, because the students need to know in advance what we define as success. As many of you know, our colleagues at the Wilson Center, I assume, here in Toronto, several Wilson Center scientists have, from the beginning of the design all the way till now, have paid part-time positions in our MD program, and they actually co-chair all of the key committees. That has been just invaluable. Each of us in the leadership positions has Wilson Center scientists that we partner with on all aspects of our design and implementation. The project management approach is a huge aspect for our success, to the point that, as I said, even once we were running, we advocated for this to become permanent positions. This was a lot of resources, both people and money. And just to point out that faculty development was a lens that was employed all the way from the design through to implementation, so that at the moment we're designing policies and practices, where the office was thinking about how are we going to support the teachers and what's the impact going to be on them. It's still, like every program, a challenge to shift the orientation of students to believe that this is low stakes, and as the evidence emerging, we're experiencing in our program too, they mostly see this as all high stakes. They're very fixated from day one on getting their residency match that they want, and make all kinds of erroneous assumptions about what will and won't impact that. I think we still have to do a lot more thought around our admissions. I personally don't think that having a perfect GPA necessarily is the most important thing, and I think we have to start placing more weight on looking at the surrogates for metacognitive capacity that will allow people to reflect and adapt as we say we want them to. This kind of change on this scale, people can have change fatigue. It takes constant support and money and time. We still have the constraints of, as I said, a traditional environment and a time-based program. Just my last slide. Some, ancillary benefits were that implementing programmatic assessment allowed us to do a lot of quality improvement on every aspect of assessment. We were moving our program to online exam administration, for example, and because we were going to then tag the questions to many different taxonomies, we examined and threw out basically half of the existing bank we had. So we did a lot of new item creation and improvement, and explicit processes for design and ongoing improvement of our assessment modalities. Assessment has become a critical lens when we're looking at policy and governance changes in our program, and this notion of checking in and coaching and early support has become a mainstay for the program. I think my time's almost up, but I'll just point out, just briefly from this slide, one important example was, cannot be done in a vacuum. So we realized our academic awards defining the best student had to be redefined to, for example, to align with this.
Right. Thank you, Glendon. I still remember that Skype call, and I'm deeply, deeply impressed by what you guys have achieved over the years. Just amazing. I now turn to my panel of experts. Who would like to respond or reflect on this implementation? Turn up your video, turn up your hand. Dario?
Okay, yeah, just wanted to, it was a great presentation. I think one thing that it was striking to me that I think could be helpful for others as well is this alignment between the curriculum transformation or curriculum reform and the assessment part. And this, I think, goes back to the issue of assessment as instructional strategy and instructional assessment as instructional design. And I think that, I think you and Lambert have written extensively about this, but I think is an important point. And the point is that that the assessment is not necessarily an assessment, purely assessment problem, but really an instructional design problem, which means that there's this very deep and strong connection between the assessment and the instructional design, and therefore the curriculum. And I think that this is one example where connecting those dots and actually having that curriculum renewal and transformation at the same time of the assessment is an important issue. And I think it's something to consider for other schools and other institutions who may want to introduce this and may think about doing both, because I think there are advantages in doing that. And the last thing is about, I think that we were talking about, this issue of programmatic instructional design approach, which is almost the interweaving of programmatic assessment and instructional design and curriculum. So I think that this is a great example of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Dario. Will you turn your video off, and Lambert can turn his video on?
Yeah, the thing that Glendon raised, and which is also a thorn in my thigh, are university policies and university rules and regulations. And I've never understood why universities insist that you have to have assessment policies and regulations which are quite prescriptive and restrictive sometimes at the university level, and why you simply don't allow schools, courses, faculties to define those rules by themselves and be accountable for them. But as you said, those rules are often not very well attuned to more professional oriented courses. I still find that amazing.
Glendon, did you have any experiences with university regulations that impeded anything you wanted to do?
I guess I would say that we had a little more latitude because, like I said, we applied to our national accreditation body because we were revamping the whole curriculum. That allowed us, I think, to kind of push to the outer limits of the latitude of the university regulations. And I think we were surprised in some instances that we were able to have more latitude than we thought. Like I said, I think the best example that comes to mind, there's smaller ones, but if we wanted to get to a point of literally having a smorgasbord of data and have a qualitative, truly holistic approach where people made decisions and we're not working against a list of standards for different modalities, we wouldn't be able to do that because the people making these policies are running faculties of arts and all different faculties. You know, I think if we got to that point, there is a mechanism that in our setting we could go through this major application progress to deviate from some of these things, but we're kind of not there yet. I don't think that has really held us back. As I said, on the holism issue, it's been interesting that holistic view of data is important, but also holistic view of context to decide what should happen for the learner. That's been really valuable. And I don't think we thought as much about the impact of that up front.
Right. Lambert?
Yeah, one of the workarounds we had is to convince Central University to add a clause to the rules that any course or faculty could deviate from the rules, provided they were able to make a submission which is evidence informed and which has a clear rationale as to why they wanted to deviate from the rules. And that was the best we could do to give ourselves some wriggle room.
And that worked.
It works, still works.
Right, okay. Given the time, Glendon, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation and nice insight in your work and in what you've done in Toronto. At another moment in time, we'll talk much more about it. I have a zillion questions, really, but let's move on. And we move from Toronto to London. Amir, can I give you the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so if I can see can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about our experience of speaking about programmatic assessment at Imperial College. We've all heard Case is very inspirational talks about programmatic assessment, but the standard response from the traditional university has always been, well, it works in Maastricht, but it doesn't work in our institution. And what are those reasons? A variety of different reasons, and I'm going to go through our narrative of how we started speaking about programmatic assessment in the context of a university like Imperial College London. Before I go into that, I want to say that our assumptions about the learning program are that it's learning-centered, it favors a holistic approach rather than atomistic learning. We all encourage deep learning strategies, but at the same time, we want to accommodate mastery-oriented assessments as well. So here are the challenges, some of the challenges. So university regulations, we are restricted by the regulations of the university, the parent university of our medical school. Modularization, we have to have assessments for modules. Those of us who have modular programs, we have to assess each module independently. We've got the external regulator, the General Medical Council in the UK, holds us accountable. We've got to make sure that our students meet the outcomes for graduates. We have got to deal with ranking. We don't like it, but we have to adhere to the decile ranking in the UK because it's used for allocating the junior doctors to jobs when they graduate. And therefore, we need to have summative assessments, high stakes, for the purpose of the ranking. The cohort size is a problem, so people often tell me, it's easy to do this in Maastricht with a smaller size, cohort of graduate students. How do we roll it out for 400 medical students? And of course, introducing change in any institution can be challenging, as we all know. So I'm going to go through my narrative. How did I start the conversation with our faculty at Imperial College School of Medicine about a hybrid model of programmatic assessment where we could draw on elements of programmatic assessment that are beneficial and at the same time meet the demands of both the university and our external regulators. These are the 6 principles I've drawn from a very, very good paper by Karen Hauer from UCSF, Principles of Programmatic Assessment. And this is how I began the conversation internally at Imperial with our heads of years, phase directors, faculty education office. So we said that we agree that we need to think about a centrally coordinated plan that aligns with and supports our curricular vision, and everybody agreed. We agreed that we need multiple tools that are used longitudinally, and we need to generate multiple data points. We agreed that we need to give our students feedback, and we need to have ready access to information-rich feedback that we provide for our students. We agreed that we need mentoring. We need to facilitate effective data use and have a meaningful conversation between the academic tutors to interpret the performance information with the students and set goals in the meetings with them. We agreed that we need to encourage self-regulated learning, encourage students to reflect and bring in elements of self-assessment. And obviously, decision-making process is integral to this. We need to be able to make decisions to ensure that our students are ready to progress. This is an analogy that I used with our faculty that it turned out to be quite helpful. So this is a photograph of my son awaiting to see a doctor in hospital. I've got this permission from his father, which is myself. And imagine that you are a clinician about to see this patient, but you have no paper records. So I asked the faculty, our clinicians, to think about they're about to see this patient, but they have no paper records or no electronic records. But they have to assess this patient. They have to come up with a diagnosis and discuss it with the patient and the parents. They have to offer an intervention, and they have to also think about the prognosis. I then asked them, how comfortable would they be in the assessment of this patient on the left? You look at the yellow heading at the top. How comfortable would they be to make a decision, offer an intervention and a prognosis if they had no past medical history? And everybody said they would be very uncomfortable. If we turn up to clinic and we've got no old notes, we've got no computers, no electronic records, we can't work, we can't function, we can't make decisions, we can't intervene, we can't offer prognosis. I then asked as well, how do we all make assessments of our students? We make decisions about their progression, we offer interventions in the form of resits or remediation, often within a very narrow window, and offer some sort of prognosis with no past learning history. Because effectively, the traditional model of assessment with a high-stakes written paper or an OSCE is that you look at a student, a snapshot, you make a decision, you offer an intervention, but with no past learning history. And this, I found, from our experience, was very, very helpful to begin the conversation. Because often, whenever you spoke about programmatic assessment, they said, it's fantastic. When Case talks about this, it's amazing, but it won't work for us. To begin that conversation, this narrative was very helpful for us to say, how comfortable are we to make diagnoses and offer interventions when we have no past learning history? And the analogy with the medical patient was quite helpful. I then showed them this growth chart from my son, and you can see his growth has been religiously plotted. This is one of the consequences of having an endocrinologist father. But you can see that at some point, he's dropping off a centile. Again, the analogy I used, it was, do we need to think about growth charts for our students? In other words, we need to have multiple data points. And at some point, when we notice that the student is not following centile, obviously people follow different centiles, and that's absolutely fine for that particular student. But even when they are falling off their own centile, you might want to start looking at how you could intervene well before you end up with a failure in a high-stakes summative assessment. So essentially introducing the idea of programmatic assessment as longitudinal collection and collation of information to ensure it's fit for purpose and the assessors understand the purpose. And I often think these simple analogies are really helpful. The faculty members are busy people. They are clinicians, they're scientists, they're working very hard. You may not achieve much by asking them to read, lengthy papers. Often these analogies, from my experience, were very helpful in bringing them along with us. So what is the purpose of an assessment program? It should facilitate learning, assessment for, assessment as learning. It should obviously enable us to make defensible decisions, and it should enable us to evaluate and improve our curriculum. So What are these data points? Obviously, we all know that any single assessment data is flawed. There is no such thing as the ideal assessment. It doesn't exist. Every assessment, by definition, compromises quality. But we do work very hard on our assessments, which often assess the bottom of the Miller's pyramid. We construct the content carefully, we design objective scoring lists, we work hard to standardize our simulated patients, we train our assessors, examiners, and we have administration procedures in place. But all of that is really helping the bottom of the Miller's pyramid, the yellow area in this middle triangle. However, the non-standard assessments, the one that assess real life practice, are valuable, and they are the so-called workplace assessments. But the assessors must fully understand the meaning and the purpose. Many of us do these in the postgraduate arena, and we know all the challenges of these assessments. Sometimes I receive about 10 or 15 of these to do the night before an appraisal, where everybody suddenly remembers they've got to do them. So there are challenges associated with these, but they are essential. So this is the model, or a schematic model of conventional assessments. We've got the course, the curriculum longitudinally. You've got some formative assessments, which effectively replicate the summative, shown as red triangles. These triangles are borrowed from a paper by Case, where they use assessments, the triangular representation of Miller's pyramid, as different forms of assessment. So you've got the red ones, which are your summative, lots of summative assessments. Suddenly, the student's faced with a lot of summative assessments. They may have had one or two formatives beforehand. And proposed that we have a hybrid model where you've got multiple data points. So you may have different modules. You've got module A, module B, C, D, E, that may be happening at different times during your course. You have multiple different assessments, and then the students then engage in a meaningful conversation with their academic tutors. And then they have the intermediate review and a final review, as well as having the summative. So what do these colorful triangles mean? So you may have SBA, single best answer questions, or VSA, the very short answers in class. You may have short answer questions. So we run this alongside the SBAs and VSAs, and the students self-rate themselves. So they do them first, and then they are given model answers, and then they rate themselves. You may collate and collect data from TBL, the IRAS, the individual, and the team-based scores. You may have workplace assessments, directly observed clinical skills, docs, or something we call CLEAR here at Imperial Clinical Learning Encounter and Reflection. You may have collaborative group projects, students doing podcasts, making posters, leaflets. And these are effectively your multiple data points that sit alongside a summative knowledge assessments that we must have as part of our engagement with the ranking process, the university requirements, etc. So whilst we can't move to a pure programmatic assessment model because of the all of the restrictions from the university regulations or external regulators, we can draw on the aspects of programmatic assessment that are beneficial for the students. So we move away from the conventional model of learning and assessment being two separate things to one where the learning and assessments are integrated. There's learning as assessment. So the sum of this assessment is no longer assessment 1, 2 to assessment N. In programmatic assessment, we think about assessments being greater than sum of the individual components. So we all know assessment drives learning, but I want to fill in the blanks with that assessments drive undesirable learning strategies as well as driving the learning for both learner and assessor. So these are the pictures I often show to our students. This is pre-COVID era. I'd say during the day, I'd like to see the library empty. I want you to be engaging and enjoying clinical practice on the wards. Obviously, this is all before COVID. So both learner and assessors can be affected by the undesirable consequences of assessments. The learners may focus on getting the grade rather than reflecting and spending less time with patients. Assessors might use this supposed objectivity of assessment as an excuse for not giving feedback. This is the model of programmatic assessment hybrid model that we have introduced in our clinical years. Again, it's very similar. So you have the workplace assessments, the docs, the directly observed clinical skills, the CLEARs for reflection, the collaborative QI project, as well as SBAs, VSAs, SAQs, TBLs, clinical practical assessments. And It's very important to triangulate data. In other words, multiple assessors and source of assessments and sequential judgment procedures ensures that you are bringing information from multiple different directions. And if there is conflicting information, you gather more information. Something we can't shy away from is expert judgment. Is really imperative. You can reduce subjectivity by training your examiners, designing scoring rubrics, bringing in performance standards, but complete objectification trivializes assessments. So we can't shy away from expert. And at the end of the day, judgment is what we do in clinical practice all the time. So all of this was born out of these meetings with Case, who very generously allowed us to discuss this with him as these ideas were being conceived. You can see on the whiteboard behind him is the first iteration of a hybrid model of programmatic assessment, where I was drawing on his board, and subsequently we've translated this into our practice. So in summary, for implementation of programmatic assessment, you need stakeholder engagement, but the narrative you use with your faculty is really important, so they understand the benefits. Use multiple assessment tools, design a coaching program, and create a learner performance dashboard. And I go back to those 6 principles from Karen Howe's nice paper in Academic Medicine: a centrally coordinated assessment plan with multiple tools that generate multiple data points allows your mentor, the academic tutor, to have a meaningful conversation. So you need a dashboard for the mentor that has a collection of all these assessments as the student progresses through the year to have a conversation. Enables the students to have self-regulated learning. At the same time, you can make decisions for student progression and obviously provide them with feedback throughout this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. I really like the way you have dealt with some of the issues you can't change and simply incorporate and work around. Also nice to hear that the term hybrid programmatic assessment model it reminds me of problem-based learning and the hybrid PBL systems that we see around the world. Any reflections from our expert panel? Lambert?
Yeah, I mean, I too am a huge fan of using clinical analogies, and a couple that I use. I mean, I find it very important. An important point of programmatic assessment is that you dare to triangulate. So you take pieces of assessment and bring them together in a meaningful narrative. Because what we typically do is, in standard assessment, we add things up because they're of the same format. But literature tells us over and over again that they don't correlate very well, and things correlate very well on content. So I typically say that I've never told a patient that their glucose level is far too low, but their sodium is far too high, so on average their lab values are okay. But that's exactly what we do in anoscopy. Your abdominal examination was disastrous, but your knee examination was good, so on average your skills are okay. The other one that I use to fight this tendency to use numbers all the time for everything, that I've never told one of my patients that they're 42.3% healthy. Why would I aim at telling my students that they're 42.3% competent? And then finally, I explain that when we work in medical schools, we've often have highly selected students who've demonstrated all their lives that they can study and cram for examinations and pass examinations. And then we invest huge resources to demonstrate that they can't pass our examinations, which creates a number needed to treat problem of an enormous magnitude. So thank you for using all these analogies. And I think they're very important because we tend to, Stella Fosniado researches what she calls naive epistemologies. We develop conceptualizations about the world around us based on experience. And even if we learn formal things afterwards, these naive conceptualizations still exist. And the naive conceptualizations of most faculty members were formed 50 years ago when they went to, or 30 years ago, when they went through their training. And having this medical narrative helps to redress those naive epistemologies something. So
So these clinical metaphors can be used to convince teachers.
Absolutely. Amazingly, when I spoke about this first in December in a programmatic assessment day in the UK, and we had heads of medical schools and assessment leads, the standard response from everybody was fascinating but impossible to do. Now, within 3 months, everybody had to resort to this because COVID kicked in, and nobody could hold, or very few people could hold, summative written or clinical assessments. And then suddenly people started engaging with this idea more. But I think there are benefits to be drawn from this pandemic, in the sense that many of the things people thought was absolutely impossible have been made possible, or at least we're able to rethink them.
Yeah, under sufficient pressure, everything becomes fluid.
Absolutely.
Harold.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation, Amir. At my school, veterinary medicine in the Netherlands, we faced similar challenges in implementing programmatic assessment over the last year. But I think most important for us, it was challenging to change the educational culture. If I were to go back and would have been able to do it all over again, I think I would even pay more attention to faculty development, but maybe also should not forget to pay more attention in enhancing students' assessment literacy. In order to change the educational culture into one that is focused more on improvement. And I would like to ask you, what would you think, in your opinion, would be the key enabler in successfully changing that educational culture into one that is and when you are to implement programmatic assessment?
Really good point. I mean, we talk about the narrative with the faculty, the narrative with the students. The most useful thing for us was the element of giving them feedback and enabling them to recognize their strengths and weaknesses before that summative moment where they in the old model, the students sit a high stakes summative assessment, and then there is a resit exam, and there isn't really much to you haven't got the capacity to achieve much in that short window. Unfortunately, we the ranking in the UK, which I understand why it's in place, but it's not very it's not very helpful, because it drives the wrong behaviors. So I would love to be able to function in a system where you've got, as we saw in the previous talk, in a satisfactory or partial satisfactory or unsatisfactory. We have to give people, we have to tell them you are 42.3% healthy, unfortunately, or competent. And it goes to several decimal places, unfortunately, because they have to be ranked for their jobs. So that's something we can't get away from, because it's how the system operates. But as far as the student narrative is concerned, I think it's the feedback. It's enabling them to recognize their weaknesses and work on it, so that they can do better in the summative assessment and in life.
Thank you. Luke?
I just want to thank you, Amir. I thought you did an amazing job of hitting all the key facets of certainly things that I have encountered in the world of dentistry, doing programmatic assessment. I think that the growth curve analogy is a really, really good one. And to echo Lambert's point as well, I think if we could move grade free and actually align people to growth curves, it would remove these barriers that we face around this constant battle of low stakes and high stakes in the students' minds, and what is important, etc., etc. So, and I do believe it's possible, and we are about to face in dentistry what you have faced in medicine, this awful ranking, which is going to undo 10 years of work as far as I'm concerned. But maybe there are ways, actually, if we convince people that you can see normal ranges of growth, we could still have a number, but that number could be related to a growth profile. And maybe the way to move forward is to talk about students' development rather than assessment. And, the assessment in that then starts going into the background, because it's always positive if we're developing someone rather than assessing them. But that was my thoughts. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you. Really.
Okay. Any other reflections? Glendon, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the piece around the culture and change aspects. And again, I think when I said about a key ingredient was the project management approach for us, and that's because that approach rigorously allows you moment to moment to be tracking all the time. What are the risks? How are you mitigating them? How are you employing communication? And the communication piece, when I said in my title, it's journey, it's because the players are changing all the time, the students, the leadership, the course directors, and you literally have to every day be championing this and be foregrounding the assessment for learning aspect, and not just saying it, but showing it, that it's driving coaching to help their performance improve. And yes, if you still have a system that shows everything adding up into numbers, that was another important thing we did away. There was all kinds of weird ways that things were translated to numbers and summed up to a percentage, and we just don't have that. The students don't get it. They get over very quickly the idea of having it.
People buy into that?
Like the students or?
Faculty and students.
Yeah, I think over time they have bought into it. It's more of a leap for the students. We can't expect them to cognitively jump from, we said we wanted you to have a perfect GPA to get in here, and now we don't want you to care about it. But it's a project and change. And I think for faculty, for example, the idea that our pass mark for written assessments is aggregated, which means it's somewhat compensatory. Initially, there was some concerns that, for example, students will game the system, they can calculate and we know they do this to some extent, but the answer to that is that it's not a one and done assessment. They have progress testing and OSCEs, and it's selling them on the idea that it's not about this moment and you jump through a hoop. We're helping you to be successful on the next hoop, and then which ultimately is to help you get better.
Okay, Suzanne, I saw your video popping up. Anything you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, if there's still time for now, I can otherwise take the next opportunity.
That's fine. If that's, yes, it's time. We need to move on.
That's why I switched it off again, because it was already time.
Well, you're going to be the first in the next round, okay? Amir, thank you very much for your great talk.
Thank you.
And, for pushing the envelope. I'm now going to invite our next speaker all the way from London to Adelaide in Australia, Lambert, late in the evening. Thanks for joining us. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Kees. I think I'm going to be brief because much of how to implement has already been covered by the previous speakers more eloquently than I could ever do that. So I'm going to focus on a couple of high-level things. So when I came to Flinders and a couple of years later, when the idea arose to start with programmatic assessment / assessment for learning, the situation was actually quite ideal. Flinders is a relatively modern university. It's one of the so-called innovative universities. It has a focus and it has had a history of innovation and innovative views on education. In its motto, there is some sort of boldness and courageousness. The motto of the foundation dean was always to experiment and to try out boldly. And courageous is apparently, according to some external consulting firm, now one of our values. So that should be good. And of course, everything was about, and the reason why we built an educational center, the Preto Center, was to make sure that we inject evidence into what we do in our education and how we change our education. So everything should be evidence informed, at least, or best available evidence based. And and it was organizationally, it was perfect. The stars aligned. Everybody down up from up the vice chancellor, deputy vice chancellor, academic, executive dean, program directors. Everybody was in agreement that we needed to do something about our assessment, and that programmatic assessment was the way to go, because there was a need clearly recognized that what we were doing up until then was not good enough anymore. So the context was favorable, the climate was supportive, and we wanted to start. But there was also some form of risk aversion. Flinders had evolved from a young 1960s, 1970s, sort of hippies on the hill type of university into one which had become more mainstream, and where a version of risk and not rocking the boat too much became more dominant in the culture. And of course, like at all the universities around the world, managerialism, neoliberalism became more dominant. The political climate changed. It did become more neoliberalist in its views, but also a bit of anti-intellectualism and anti-academics viewpoints emerged with our political leaders, and that all had led to an extreme commodification of education. So we didn't no longer talk about students or learners, but about clients and consumers and what have you. So those things were aspects that we also had to take into account. So after a couple of years of planning where we tried to mitigate and prevent any risk, and we tried to nail down the whole project to the utmost detail that we could think of, suddenly funding became available, and we saw the window of opportunity, and we started with a very quick implementation phase because we had the whole program ready, or project documentation already ready. So we did a trial in year one with a small group of students who were raving about it. They thought it was magnificent to have a learning coach and to look and to build a portfolio and reflect and analyze on their learning. So we started with an introduction in year one, and we assumed that we would grow with the students. So from year one, year two, year three, year four, etc. And it would lead to a gradual introduction. But then a couple of things happened. A new vice chancellor came in, and of course what vice chancellors do, they restructure. So we had a massive restructure, an hire and fire, or a spill and rehire type of restructure. There was suddenly what the Germans call a fear for their own courage. Oh God, what did we do? This is not what we had in mind. This is far too disruptive. With the ensuing disinvestment in education, because again, the rankings play a role, and there is the general assumption that if you have to invest in research and not in education to go up in the rankings, which after a couple of years and restructure led to change fatigues. We do have our university policies, and then last year or this year, COVID-19 happened as well. And that sort of screwed up our plans, actually. So what we are left with is that we have learning coaches. So every student has a coach who meets regularly, not frequently enough, I think, but regularly with the student, analyzes their progress and achievement, helps them to set learning goals and to strategize and prioritize their learning. We do have a form of longitudinal assessment. We've got progress tests based on the key feature approach, progress testing, so we've got that. But we still have very traditional, straightforward block testing, OSCEs, in-training assessments, unstructured in-training assessments, assignments, and what have you, which are very dominant and basically make the whole aspect of programmatic assessment and the meeting with the learning coaches and the self-regulating three aspects as seen by students as something which is formative on the side, but the real meat lies in the processing, the block testing, and the real structured numerical assessment. So we're stuck with an assessment program which has some good aspects, but there is no real longitudinality. We're not really looking at growth. There is no integration or triangulation by content, what I said earlier on. There is no issue of proportionality. Decision making happens at 2 points in the year, and it's basically all or nothing. There is no prognostic process in place. The decision making process is highly numerical. Somebody high up in the hierarchy basically said to me, "I'd rather have bad numbers than good words in our assessment," which leads that we to the situation where we are actually unable to really give timely feedback which can be enacted by the students. But we've learned a couple of very valuable lessons, and I want to reiterate what has been said before. It's culture, culture, and culture. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, and there is an espoused culture and there's a lived culture, and there can be a huge gap between both. And if the lived culture is not one that embraces disruptions, and programmatic assessment is a disruptive, and assessment for learning are disruptive, fundamentally different views on assessment. But if the culture sees innovation as doing the same thing but slightly different, like now our lectures are online instead of face-to-face, then this is too much of a disruption. That leads to the necessity to explain, because people may buy into the philosophy and say, yeah, that makes sense, yeah, good idea. But as soon as they have to make detailed design decisions about assessment, they tend to revert to the way it's done when they were a student, and they tend to revert to traditionalism. So you have to be on the ball all the time for quite a long time. You have to adapt. That's what we've learned. You cannot simply copy something from somewhere else. And everybody will say and agree that with that and say, yeah, that works in Maastricht, but it doesn't work here. And at the same time, they ask, where's the randomized controlled trial that shows that it works everywhere? So it is a fine line between explaining that you cannot just pick something from city A and bring it to place B, but you have to adapt. So you have to understand the principles. And the principles are necessary because the context before and after the medical degree matters. One of our internship regions wants us to produce Z scores by which of our student achievements, by which they decide whether students get an internship in their hospitals or not. That doesn't really align with the notion of programmatic assessment. It's good to have money right from the start for the project, but if you don't think about how it's going to be funded and resourced beyond the project life, the implementation life, you find yourself in a very difficult situation where you're under-resourced and understaffed. So when you start with this, think about what happens after the project life. And then finally, we realized that programmatic, when PBL started, it was sometimes preached as a dogma. Thou shalt always do. But PBL is based on certain principles, and programmatic assessment and assessment for learning are also based on certain principles. And you do not always have to use them full blown, but be aware of what the principles are and be strategically opportunistic in applying those principles in any situation that you can do, and gradually move ground into a more full-blown programmatic assessment. Those are the lessons that we've learned in the past 5 or 6 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Lambert. A nice example how difficult it is to change an existing process. And it's interesting to see that Toronto made a full curriculum change, which included programmatic assessment. You think that also might be a reason why you haven't been able to adopt all the elements of programmatic assessment?
I think there wasn't an appetite to go the whole way, and people wanted to test the waters first before that.
Yeah.
But that's why we're being strategically opportunistic. Let me give you a small example. We've got progress tests. We do progress tests online. It's very difficult to invigilate. So what we've done instead is we offered everybody whose score is either unsatisfactory or doubtful extra remedial coaching. And we're explaining to our students that although tests were originally designed mimicking psychological tests to discriminate between people, that's not the remit of our educational organization. Our remit is actually to teach and to bring everybody up to speed. So we're using these principles and try to fill them in wherever we can.
Amir?
And I was just going to clarify that we introduced the new hybrid model as part of a new curriculum. So as we embarked on revising our curriculum and introducing a new one, that was the opportunity. So I totally agree, introducing this sort of thing in an existing curriculum will be very difficult. So if there's an opportunity to do a curriculum revision, I would bring assessments into it, because effectively you can't revise a curriculum without rethinking your assessments.
Right. Dario?
Yeah, I just wanted a couple of things. I mean, I want to thank Lambert for those very helpful lessons learned. I mean, I would say, a couple of comments. I mean, one is, I was stricken by the culture. I mean, underneath, I'll probably put context, which I think is part of that culture. Because, I mean, there is no implementation without context. I mean, without taking into consideration the context. I mean, and it seems that the context may have changed a little bit from what you mentioned from the beginning towards maybe a different time, within the implementation of programmatic assessment. And that context obviously is the interaction of so many elements that go from, leadership to organizational readiness to organizational culture. I mean, to a number of other, to social support and social relations, that it's so important, I think, to really consider that. And that goes to the issue of explain, is, I think, inquire about the context, understand the context, and then explain and see what are some of the factors that can mitigate those evolving, changing contexts. Because, I mean, some people even define culture as an evolved context. I mean, and so that's something to take into consideration. I mean, the other thing that I think is very important, and you mentioned also, was the one of the that from the implementation sciences we have seen is also the issue of adaptability. I think adaptability is one of the key elements of one of the key traits of a successful organizational culture. And I think the ability to adapt to the needs of the institution, of the context, is a key. I mean, and therefore, the issue is going to be the balance. What is adaptability in that sense, and what we are able to adapt to? What are some of the core components that we want to keep, and what are some of the peripheral so-called components that we can make changes? And there was an example that I thought was interesting in one article about the issue of, for example, reminders for clinicians in an electronic medical record. It's not so much the issue is we want to have reminders because we think they may be helpful, but whether they are on the left side or the right side of the screen, whether they're on one page or another, there is no much difference. I mean, and so we can adapt that part if we think that can help. So I think, I thank you for those very, very helpful messages about those lessons learned in relation to culture, context, implementation, and adaptability.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dario. Luke?
Yeah, I have felt your pain, Lambert, over the years, definitely. When we first did this around 10 years ago, I had an existing curriculum and had to bring in aspects of programmatic assessment. And I hit multiple cultural barriers, not just from staff, but also from students, because of course they were viewing suddenly a massive increase in high stakes. And I always felt we needed to give students what they needed, not necessarily what they wanted. The trick is to give them what they need in the way that they want, if that's possible. But that requires quite a big change in their culture. And I think one of the biggest things to target that we often overlook is actually working on the students, trying to explain to them what is happening, why this is better for them. And I gradually managed to make traction, not with every student, but did make traction. And then the students started asking, once they got their head around it, for more feedback. And then other people started changing what they did. And then I've been fortunate enough in the last 2 years to actually have a blank piece of paper, write a curriculum from scratch from the lessons learned from that. But one of the things that I think is quite important when you're designing these things, think about what you want to drive in your students. So one of the things that I designed in there was to have, a milestone or a learning outcome, if you like, around demonstrating about engagement with feedback, about personal development, and then giving them the tools to provide the evidence. And the tools, of course, were engaging with assessment processes that I would want. So I think, you have to think not only about the culture of your staff, but your students are a massively powerful weapon to change staff attitude, and ultimately we're doing it for them. So I would just like to make that point. I totally agree with everything you've done. I do think you can do it in stages, but get the students on board as early as possible, and they will help drive change. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.
Suzanne.
I would like to use that as a stepping stone for some of the reflections I had during these presentations. First of all, I want to compliment all these very brave leaders, I think, trying to change this assessment world, which is hard, based on the points that are already mentioned by the presenters. But I would like to take this student perspective a step further than it's already been taken, because we're talking about the importance of stakeholders' involvement. Assessment literacy was pointed out by Harold Bock. Explain was just pointed out by Lambert. I think we need to much more radically democratize the whole process, in which the student should also, I think, have a voice in. So I would like to change the explain situation to negotiate, discuss, negotiate, because I think if we really embrace or value this self-regulatory assumption or ambition, or this professional's lifelong learning attitude, then we need to consider, I think, the student as such a professional, at least a novice one, who should have a say in these standards. And we were talking about standards and perfect GPAs, and Glenda mentioned students need to know upfront what they need to do to succeed. That is still, I think, a very old world, which which with a hierarchy of power in who determines the standards and what is considered good. And I would like the panels to reflect on taking it one step further.
There's a huge difference between being a medical student in a publicly funded university in a country where you get a bourse, where you get a scholarship with a relatively low contribution to the actual fees needed for being taught for a year in med school, and students who are mature students who have a family to support, who pay $36,000 per year for their studies, who will have to do an internship afterwards and only start earning money after the internship, or real money after the internship. When I was a medical student in the Netherlands and I had to redo a year, tough luck, that's it. But if I'm a medical student in Australia, that is a decision that cost me $36,000 extra, plus an end of career annual income and build up of superannuation. So that's a $300,000 to $500,000 decision. The stakes are quite high for students.
Yeah. And I understand this dependency, but it's also, it changes per context. But for example, the point mentioned by Glendon and also Amir, I think, was the dependency students have to get into their residency program, which is also maybe something that really influences the dependency and the power dynamics in undergraduate and postgraduate as well. But I don't say like we are the only ones that need to negotiate with students. We should also fight like the accreditation system as well into a negotiating system. And I understand that this dependency aspect is part of the context in which explains why they will jump through any hoop we will set up. Also the hoop of you need to reflect and you need to self-assess. I just think that in order to change that world, or the assumption that we have, or the values that are underneath the assessment for learning philosophy, really need to change those, the autocracy that we still have in higher education, I think. And I think Glendon wants to.
Okay, Glendon, you may.
Just briefly, just one little point, Suzanne, about you're right. It is a traditional notion of telling people upfront what they need to do to be successful. The way we dealt with that, though, is that in one of those course buckets that I described, being satisfactory is not always numerical. So both students and faculty have come to tolerate that in that list of things that you need to be satisfactory, and it's non-compensatory across those modalities in that list. Sometimes the standard is satisfactory, so there is going to be expert professional judgment. They have to submit these progress reviews into the learner chart. That's a requirement to pass the course. So if the coach does not sign off on that, it has to get revised. Those are just examples. The other piece, the student engagement, is huge. So in our program, definitely from the design phase and all the way through till now, we have a huge student governance structure, and they are embedded multiple students in every single committee. The only thing I would say about that is we have to always remember that they're on their way to becoming something. They're not there yet. So it's balancing a voice when also they don't sometimes have the expertise to decide for themselves. But then when they don't, yes, you have to explain and teach them. So when they ask us a question around anything, standard setting, something that we thought, a student wouldn't want to know, or I took for granted when I was in medical school, we go to their class of 270 people and we present to them in dialogue about it.
Okay, guys.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Just
we
one.
have less than 10 minutes left. We're going to address some of the questions from all the people who attended this this symposium, because I want to give them the chance to ask their questions. And Roberta, have you selected some of those questions? You're muted.
Sorry for that. I will publish some questions from the audience and they will appear on screen, and I would like to invite the presenters and the panel members to react on them. The first question is from Rashmir Kusukar. Can you see it on screen?
Not yet. Yep.
Yes, should be. Rashmi asked, how do you get the teachers to implement this in the intended way? Do presenters have some thoughts about it, or panel members?
We heard some strategies, huh? The medical metaphors use, the strong involvement. Amir,
Yes.
go on.
They need to own it. The people will make change only if they believe it. So the most
Right.
important step is to make them understand the benefits and the fact that they would be supported from the medical school, dental school, or vet school leadership. Right. If they own it and they feel supported and they believe in it, then they will do the work.
Right. Okay. Lambert?
Definitely.
Yeah, basically the same thing. And I think the comment of using or involving the student as agentic stakeholders in it is important as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Luke?
Yeah, I think it's my experience was to get a small number of enthusiastic people involved in an area, and then when the other staff started seeing the dividends, because one of the big problems we'd always had in dentistry was the I hate the term, but the failing student still creeping through because there just wasn't sufficient data, or there wasn't a means of stopping it. And when people started seeing the value of having large amounts of data, and those students that they had concerns over actually were flagging up, that made a great inroad to people actually then getting on board. But it's a very difficult one.
Yeah, definitely. We also had questions from Marnix Weststein, and he had quite a provoking question. How about making the first half of a program completely formative and the second half summative, and making the student responsible for filling its portfolio? What are your thoughts about it? Amir?
This is an interesting idea. It's very challenging when the schools determine what the students see as their future. So even though we may think, the job that they do in the first year doesn't actually matter really in the grand scheme of things, and no matter how many times I tell them your future does not depend on that very first job that you do. Understanding the geography is important to some people, but a lot of them think that this is the key step in their progression as a clinician. So in reality, it won't work, because everything that matters, and Chris Harrison has made a really good comment there about the dangers of retaining summative systems. I could not agree more. The problem is that we can't get out of these ranking systems. It's beyond our control, and the students get so fixated to the 5th decimal place. It's incredible. So we have to find a balance between.
Yeah, definitely.
If I could throw the cat amongst the pigeons, I would actually want to have it the other way around. So if I could design my ideal programmatic assessment for learning program, it would start with quite summative and quite prescriptive in year 1, but I would gradually release the students and allow them to take more agency and accountability over their own assessment. And my idea of a final decision-making process would be where the student has built their own portfolio and applies for graduation and says, I think I'm now ready to progress to the next phase. And they have to make the case that they are ready for the next phase, because that's what they are going to do after they get their degree. The degree is not magical. There is no pixie dust on the degree that suddenly makes you this self-regulated learner. So if we don't allow our students to take agency over their own learning during the time that we have some control over the process, how can we then tell society that we've prepared them for a situation where they have to do that? So I would rather have it the other way around.
Yeah, that's a very good idea, indeed.
Look.
I would agree completely with Lambert. I think for me, there is no formative and summative. It's just data. It's about what do you do with that data? How does the student use it to develop, and how do you use it to make a decision? And I think this is very, very important to reflect on with our current generation Z, who have very poor locus of control. The locus of control has been with society pretty much all the way through their childhood and early adulthood. And if we do not switch the locus of control over, then I would very much worry about our medical professionals of the future. So yeah, moving from a situation of, not spoon feeding, but giving them support to work through the data, and then giving them the agency later in the curriculum to make decisions about readiness, I think would be the absolute ideal. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and it also probably changes the summative culture in the minds of the students. Yeah, definitely. There's room for just one final question from Paul Geisler. He asked, from any of the speaker or panelists, I'm curious as what kind of things didn't work, which you may have tried to implement in your own assessment of your PA, you threw out either because of ineffectiveness or overlap or resources. Are there any implementations who have encountered this? Luke? Yeah, at the very start, when we built our first interfaces, I made all sorts of disastrous decisions with respect to how to present the data, even down to using the color red to show things that weren't right, having data that didn't update frequently. I effectively, if I was honest, I built a killing machine the first time I tried this, and had quite a student staff rebellion on my hands. So yeah, it can become an unholy mess very, very quickly. But what you've got to do is you've got to we make mistakes. You listen to the feedback. You work with the students and the staff, and you try and bring it round. But I still, to this day, still with some students fight the formative summative issue, and it's very, very interesting. In the UK, we have this thing called a National Student Survey, and I've come to the conclusion now when I read the comments, I know which students are ready to graduate because they're the ones that refer to development and how useful all the feedback's been, and the ones that really shouldn't have probably graduated, at least from a thought process point of view, because they're the ones that are always complaining about too many assessments and how hard it is. So yeah, you can get things wrong very, very easily.
Lambert, one small comment.
Yeah, a small comment is that the biggest failure has been to provide a good IT infrastructure underlying all this. Most commercial learning management systems are emulations of databases. They're based on tables and records that you combine, but you predefine how they are being combined. For me, programmatic assessment, that triangulation of information is important. So what we should actually have had in terms of IT support systems should be something that emulates qualitative analysis software rather than databasing. And I think that's a fundamental design flaw in the IT.
Thank you very much. Well, it's time right now. I want to thank you all for your very nice presentations. The panel experts with their were very nice comments. I think we've learned a lot. We learned about culture, but is it only culture? Is it context? Or maybe even negotiating with the students? I think this is a very nice discussion. I hope you got all inspired today. I did. And I want to thank you all. And I also want to announce the next session of this conference, which will be held at the 8th of October, and it's about progress testing. So we hope you'll all be there. And as a final comment, soon there will be popping up a survey on the screen. And I will kindly ask you to fill in the survey. And also the last question will be, do you want to share your details? So if you want to continue this interesting discussion, you can email the attendees, you can email the presenters or the panel members if you want, and get this discussion going, because I think it's a very interesting discussion. And I think this is very interesting to hear. I want to thank you all and see you next time.
Thank you very much. See you next time.
Bye.